First of all, I want to say thank you for being here tonight. Everybody got one of these flyers. I thought it would take a few minutes to do what we can to, first of all, give you an orientation and also introduce everyone. I'm Kerby Anderson. I'll be your first speaker and also kind of the MC. And then Steve Cable, who is right here, will be speaking on the idea of apologetics. If you don't know what that is, that's why we're here to explain that. And Steve has been our Senior Vice President of Probe Ministries. He's a graduate of both an undergraduate degree and a master's degree from Rice University, postgraduate work at Southern Methodist University. He's worked in the high-tech field. A little bit later when I formally introduce him, we'll talk about his book, and I think you'll learn a bit more about some of the things we'll be talking about there. And so those will be the presentations tonight, then I'll come back and finish off when, as I will introduce Sue Boland in just a minute. Her husband was supposed to be here, so I'm going to be covering that one on God, philosophy, and science. But then let me introduce Sue Boland. Sue Boland is an individual that has been one of our associate speakers, and is an individual that is a professional calligrapher, and will be speaking, as you can see here, on two issues. If God is good, why does he let me hurt? And is Jesus the only way? And then a third one, which is now also Grace and Truths about LGBT. So she may be the hardest worker of the bunch because she'll speak 3 times. And so I think you'll really appreciate her. And then Tom Davis, who's in the back here, will be speaking tomorrow on the whole issue of the reliability of the Bible. Do we believe the Bible is reliable? And he has gone to such places as College in Dallas Baptist University, has his master's degree in Christian apologetics, has worked with Ratio Christi. I think you will really appreciate all of those. And as we just said a minute ago, if you have questions, we'll be glad to entertain those questions. When we go to lunch, you can come with us to lunch and pepper us with questions over food or whatever you would like to do. But if you've noticed on the bottom here, you have a QR code. So those of you that have your phone, if you do what I just did a minute ago, you will then see, for example, every slide that will be up there. If you want, you have access to it. So you have an outline and you have slides for every one of these presentations. Again, we should thank Sue and Steve for making a lot of that possible. So if you find yourself saying, that went too fast, or I'd like to see it again, or I would like to use that and give that to a friend, we really want to equip you if we can, so that when people ask questions, you'll have answers. So even though they'll be leaving tomorrow afternoon, I hope that this will be the first of many opportunities we can interact with you, certainly digitally. Now, is that a good deal? I mean, first of all, if you're young, you love that. You'd rather say, I'd rather have it digitally than on a piece of paper. Big piece of paper, that's some 20th century stuff. We're in the 21st century. What you'll find is when you're having a conversation with individuals, maybe you're having a debate or a discussion, they might at one point ask you a question, well, how do you know that? So, well, wait a minute, I got this on my phone here, or I got this on my computer, and then you will have access to that. So that's a pretty good deal. So every presentation, if you want, you have access to, and I hope that you'll take advantage of that as well. So tonight we're going to talk about worldviews, and I thought if you got your Bible, turn with me to Colossians chapter 2, verse 8. This is kind of be a theme for some of what we'll be talking about all weekend. But in Colossians 2, so here we see Paul is really warning about some issues that Christians in the first century, and I still think Christians in the 21st century need to be concerned about. And in Colossians 2, verse 8, see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elementary spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. We'll probably get into that a little bit more as we go through this, but one of the things I want you to do is we're going out into the world. When we finish on Saturday, you're going to go back into that world. And you're going to be having people that maybe are going to, there's various philosophies, various kind of cult ideas, various kinds of opinions, do things that would maybe affect you, or maybe even challenge your faith. And so we want to give you some tools. In a sense, these are your tools for your evangelism toolbox. These are tools for your apologetics toolbox to be really helpful. Now, you also probably have noticed there's a lot of cameras around here, which last time we were here, we didn't have quite so many cameras, no? but that's because we're doing a live streaming. So there may be people all sorts of places that are actually watching this. And as God's sense of humor would go, after I produced this particular presentation and gave it to Sue, we got a voicemail at Probe from an individual in Tampa, Florida. And he said, I'm teaching on worldviews, and I'm teaching from this book by Jim Sire. Do you happen to have a presentation? And I said, well, it just so happens I've had an old one, but I just upgraded that one, and I'm going to use it in Laredo. So not only is this presentation being heard right now in Laredo, it's being heard in Tampa, Florida. And of course, anybody watching the live stream right now is as well. So let's get into this issue of worldview. And although I tend to move around a lot, so the cameras are here, I will try probably not move as much as I normally do. But has anybody ever heard the term worldview? How many of you have heard that? Okay, a lot of you have. Some of you say, no, I haven't. And so what I'm going to try to do is have enough basic information. If you've never heard it before, you will understand that, because we're going to use the term worldview a lot in this conference. But if some of you heard it, maybe you can have it in a Christian school, give you enough new information that it'll be worth your while. So first of all, let's, if I can, talk about a biblical foundation for this. And one of those ideas is here. Just a minute ago, we saw that the Apostle Paul in Colossians said, do not take it, that we're supposed to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. We see this in 2 Corinthians, but a minute ago he just simply said, do not be taken captive. Same Greek word. The bottom line is, if you're not thinking biblically, the world will take you over. So one of our foundations tonight is to begin to think about how to develop a Christian world and life view. But the second part of our foundation is, and you will hear Steve address that next hour, here in Peter says that we should always be ready to make a defense to anyone or everyone who asks you to give an account that for the hope that is in you. He'll go into that in more detail, but that's sort of like defense. So we're going to give you both offense and defense. If you think about that in terms of sports. And so that's kind of how we're going to go about this. I mentioned the book by Jim Sire. If you're looking for a book to maybe help you understand worldview, that is his idea. And he said, really, a worldview is kind of like a set of presuppositions. That's a big word, but like a set of assumptions, a set of opinions that you have, which hold about the basic makeup of our world. Another way to look at this is a worldview is like a set of glasses. You notice a lot of approach that word glasses. I tend to be, I think, the only one that doesn't. But, glasses help you see clearly. And so it really help you to, in a sense, see something you can't see very well. A better illustration is I do sometimes wear colored glasses because I actually shoot shotguns at flying clays. It's called sporting clays. And they say that because of that particular color, you can see them more easily. I know that there are some individuals that go golfing and they wear blue sunglasses so they can see the golf ball. And so in some respects, a worldview helps you to see some things. And so that's really what we want to help you begin to think about. He gives us a very long description here, but again, he says it's a commitment of fundamental orientation of the story, about the idea of a set of presuppositions, but it's also something that really affects the foundation of which we live. And I think what we're going to find is, as we go through this, you're going to really need to begin to think about that idea of a worldview. Because a worldview is really something that everybody has. If I turn on the television set tonight, do the people that are actually giving me the news, do they have a worldview? If I go into a college classroom and a professor, does he or she have a worldview? Do individuals that play music that you listen to, do they have a worldview? Of course they do. Everybody has a worldview. Sometimes they may not be able to explain it, but they do have a worldview. And so, again, we recognize that we are living in a world where we have almost a supermarket of worldviews, different kinds of ideas. We live in a polarized society. So we really want you to be able to begin to discern that. Sometimes I find people will say, until I had this class on worldview, I just used to listen to music or I would watch a movie and I wouldn't think about it. And now you've ruined it for me, because now I sit there and I go, okay, what are they trying to get across to me here? Why is that lyrics that way? Why does that movie have that particular set of assumptions? And so that's really why we're going to spend some time talking about worldview. I put this up here for one illustration. It can get very complex. You can talk about, does God exist? Does God not exist? We're going to talk about that about 2 hours from now. But then if we have an individual that believes one thing, that leads them in one direction, believes something else, leads them in a different direction. And what we'll find very quickly when we talk about this issue of worldview is it can be a lot complex. But I'm going to try to make it pretty simple. Even the book by Jim Sire, he talks about everything from Christian theism and deism and naturalism and existentialism, New Age movement. Maybe you've heard some of that, but we're going to try to make it a whole lot simpler than that as well. Also, a worldview is really different than a world religion. If you think about this, these are some of the world religions of the world. You can see, for example, that you have Hindu and Muslim and Christian, secular, Buddhist. You have all sorts of different worldviews that are expressed by world religions, but a world view is broader than even that as well. Matter of fact, it just gives you a little bit of an idea where some of these world religions are. Pretty much Christian and all the way over here to Eastern views as well. So obviously, we live in a world where there are different kinds of religions. I might just say that if you find yourself maybe witnessing to somebody of a different religion, this is one of our books that we have on our book table that you might want to find more about, because you might say, well, how would I witness to a Muslim? How would I witness to a Buddhist? Well, the good news is next hour, Steve's going to give you some suggestions on that. So hold that question for just a few minutes, because he will give you some possible ways in which you could witness to some of those individuals. We're going to make it real simple. 3 worldviews tonight. We're going to talk about a theistic worldview. And that would be everything from Christianity to Islam or Judaism, the so-called religions of the book. Although we'll give you an actual Christian worldview as your plumb line, as your measuring stick. Then we'll talk about a worldview of naturalism, that nature is all that there is. That's a worldview associated with, maybe you've heard of humanism, Marxism, existentialism. And then the third worldview we'll look at will be pantheism. That'd be kind of the worldview of Buddhism, Hinduism, and the New Age movement. And so we're going to just look at 3. And I think in some respects that's going to be enough. But when we talk about a worldview, we also think that it's going to be important for you to know how to test a worldview. It's a good way to test your own worldview, and it's a good way to begin to witness to other individuals by asking good questions. Because first of all, a worldview needs to answer this question: why are we here? Why is there something rather than nothing? I mean, it could be that it just was a cosmic explosion, and yet here we are. You've got to have that question answered. It's an important one. How do you explain human nature? Do you think people are basically good, and that they've been corrupted by society, or to believe that a human sinfulness and sin nature? Those are, I think, important questions to really begin to ask. Another one is, how do you know that you know? How do you know what's true? As a matter of fact, you'll hear Sue talking this weekend about this idea that sometimes there's these 4 killer questions. And one of those is, do you know that? How do you know that that's true? I think those are really important questions sometimes to ask individuals. Or how do you determine what is right and wrong? We have some people that say, well, just let the majority of people determine what is right and wrong. We as Christians say, well, we use the Bible to determine what is right and wrong. And so that's going to be, I think, really important as we get into these in just a minute. And then what's the meaning of history? Is history just a lot of random facts? Or is it just circular? Or is history going to some culmination, the return of Christ? Really important. And then, most importantly, what happens to a person after death? We have a lot of individuals in our culture today that simply say, you live, you die, you're dirt. That's all there is. You have others say, well, wait a minute, we believe that we are headed towards an eternal destiny. And so these are really kind of important questions. And I'm going through these fairly quickly because as we develop these various talks over the next 2 days, you'll begin to see how they're important. And I think you can see that if you've ever maybe been in a class where they've talked about understanding the times, gone to Summit Ministries, maybe you've been homeschooled in Christian schools, sometimes they show us different kinds of worldviews out. We're not going to get that confusing, but we are going to recognize that when we talk about a worldview, your worldview should correspond with reality. One of the best tests are, sometimes people will say, well, this is what I believe. And Dr. Phil used to say, well, how's that working out for you? Does that really correlate with your particular viewpoint? And so that's an important question. Does your worldview correspond with reality, or are you living in a fantasy? The second one is consistency. Does this biblical worldview, or does any worldview, hold together? You're going to have Tom talk about this idea of the Bible. You ever heard anybody say, well, the Bible has contradictions? Ever heard that? Sure you have, right? Now, what about those contradictions? Well, the quick answer is, name one. I find a lot of people start looking at their toes because they really haven't thought through. I just heard that. But does the Bible have contradictions? Does the Book of Mormon have contradictions? Does the Quran in Islam have contradictions? By the way, the answer is to both of those questions, yes. But it's, again, a very important conversation starter if you're involved in evangelism with individuals. Comprehensive. Does your worldview explain all of the data? As we talk a little bit later about this idea of naturalism, we have individuals that say that everything is here as a result of mass, energy, chance, and time. Everything's just a cosmic accident. Well, then how do you get personality out of evolution of a rock, evolution of animals? How do you get this idea of a sense of the spirit? And there are all sorts of things that some of these worldviews really do not cover. And finally, can the truth claims of this worldview be verified, or can they be falsified? Again, Tom is going to take you through tomorrow morning why we believe the Bible is reliable. And you're going to have him talk about all sorts of evidence, archaeological evidence, historical evidence, as well as all sorts of other very important pieces that show that the truth claims of the Bible can be verified, not the least of which is fulfilled prophecy and so much more. So we're going to give you some really helpful material. But what we are going to do now, just for the next couple minutes, then we'll take a break, because this will be the shortest of the presentations, because it's kind of the setting the scene for what you'll now hear for the rest of the evening. Let's think of 3 different worldviews. And so the first one would be a Christian worldview. Now, if you notice, what we've done is we've got a circle here. We've got God in the upper story here, human beings in the lower story. Does that make sense? And so what we're saying here is that's kind of our diagram of the fact that we believe there is a material realm and there's a spiritual realm. And so how does that play out? Well, the first is one of the elements of a Christian worldview is monotheism. What's that? The belief in one God, okay? And that is certainly the case. The second is creation ex nihilo. When we heard Kerby Anderson talk with at least one Latin term. So that's creation out of nothing. God spoke in Genesis 1 and what? Created the world. Number 3, this idea of supernaturalism. There's a natural world, but there's a supernatural. There are miracles. Miracles like the parting of the Red Sea. Miracles like the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The next one would be a human need. What's that? A biblical view would be our need is that we are sinful. We're cut off from God. Our human nature would also say because we're sinful, we have a need, and we have a human destiny. If we accept Jesus Christ as our Savior and Lord, then we are headed to eternal communion with Him or eternal separation from Him. That's pretty simple, isn't it? That's kind of what we would call Sunday School 101. By the way, I might just mention for some of the people that just walked in here, if you look at the bottom of your page here, because I see some of you writing furiously, you will notice when you do the QR code, it will actually pop up this slide so that if as you're taking notes, you will have access. There's an outline there, and there's some of that. So I thought I'd just mention for some of you that are trying to get all this down. But this was pretty simple, isn't it? I mean, if you are learning this for the at the first time, we maybe have to have some other conversation, because this is kind of what we learn in Sunday school class. So let's now use this as our ruler, or our plumb line, or our grid to evaluate the other two worldviews. With me on that? Okay, so let's now go to naturalism. What we are missing here is no God here. Instead, we just believe, naturalism just believes that nature is all that there is. There's no God, no supernatural, no miracles, just the world around us. And so as a result, most people that believe in naturalism either are atheists meaning they don't believe in God, or they might be deists. Yeah, maybe there's a God that started a long time ago, but he's not involved in the day-to-day activities. And so that's different than the one where we just talked about monotheism. We talked about creation ex nihilo. In this case, they would believe in what? Evolution, which is why I'm going to talk about that about 2 hours from now, and get into that in some detail. One of the greatest challenges sometimes for Christians is how to respond to this idea of evolution. Number 3, materialism, that matter is all that there is. There's no supernatural, it just matters. What you see around us is it. There's no heaven, there's no hell, there's no God, there's no angels, there's no demons. It's just matter. That's all it is. Then human autonomy, well, since there's no God, I can make up my own decisions about what is right and wrong, how to live my life. I don't consult the Bible. Then, of course, I can do that because I am dependent upon human reason. And then finally, science becomes more important. Whereas with the Bible and a Christian worldview, we say that theology is important. Biblical understanding is important. In this case, science becomes more important. Now, I'm not anti-scientific, at least 2 of my degrees are in science, but it's the idea that science is more important now, matter of fact, preeminent to everything else. Now, if you have turned on a television set recently, opened up a newspaper recently, maybe even gone to a college classroom, what worldview do you most often run into? Probably this one. This is kind of the dominant worldview. If you open up the newspaper, New York Times, Washington Post, things like that, most of the people writing, not all, are writing it from a naturalistic point of view. If you go to universities all over the state of Texas here, unless it's a Christian university, you will oftentimes, again, have a naturalistic worldview. So this has been sort of the dominant worldview of the 20th century. But as we're getting into the 21st century, there's another worldview that's also being expressed, and that's the worldview of pantheism. But before we do that, I thought I just might mention that sometimes naturalism shows up in the movies. I think sometimes the best way to illustrate some of these worldviews is to think that. This is a one called Contact. That's where Jodie Foster and Matthew McConaughey actually play that there are individuals. In this case, she plays Harry Holloway, and she is actually scanning the heavens, trying to find intelligent life somewhere else in the universe. Not looking for God, but looking for maybe more advanced individuals that maybe can help us with our crisis here. And so it starts, because the book was written by Carl Sagan, an astronomer at Cornell. That is kind of a worldview. Or Prometheus, another one, which led to all of the Alien movies, which again shows at the point where some aliens came to this planet and impregnated it, and thus we have individuals that are tied to some other extraterrestrial somewhere else. And so that's kind of the worldview of naturalism. You want to talk about people that express that. This would be Richard Dawkins. Anybody ever heard the name Richard Dawkins? Anybody know who he is? The atheist? Okay. We're going to kind of beat up on interest a little bit here, but he wrote the book called The God Delusion. The idea that, well, you guys that believe in God, well, that's just deluded. Or you have Peter Singer at Princeton University. When he was alive, Christopher Hitchens, God is not good. Of course, we always have to talk about Bill Maher, the resident atheist, and so these are individuals expressing naturalism. So I gave you some examples from movies, certainly can give you some examples from some speakers, but let's go one more. Talk about a Christian worldview, talk about a naturalistic worldview. Let's now talk about a pantheistic. You notice my diagram, what I did was I took this idea of God in the upper story and kind of shoved it down in the lower story and put kind of a lowercase God. Because the idea ultimately is there's no God out there, God is in here. God is in the rocks and in the trees, He's in you and He's in me. And if you want to understand that, you can begin to see that instead of the idea of monotheism, they believe in what's called monism. What is that? All is one. Then, because all is one, pantheism, pan meaning all, theism meaning God, all is God. God is in the rocks and the trees, He's in you and me, and that, of course, leads to the idea of human divinity. I don't look for God out there, I look for God in here. And thus, that becomes my idea of seeking what we might call cosmic consciousness through various kinds of experiences, various kinds of techniques, get in touch with the divine. Of course, they also believe in reincarnation. Now, here in Laredo, Texas, not sure there are too many people you run into that believe in reincarnation, but I was born in Berkeley, California. I every year go to Oregon and Washington, and I can tell you, you can go to places like Boulder, Colorado, Seattle, Washington, Berkeley, California, run into lots of people that believe in reincarnation. And the latest Gallup polls found that at least a quarter of Americans think reincarnation might be possible. So you can see how that has had an impact as well. Well, because there's no God, there's no principles, there's no right or wrong, there's just moral relativism. You have your set of ethics, I have my set of ethics, you have a different set of ethics. And so as a result, these different values are very significant. Now, how does that manifest itself? Anybody ever seen the movie The Matrix? The Matrix is a good example of that because you have this idea that the world as you see around you is really an illusion. You're kind of batteries and are individuals that think you're in reality, but you're in a virtual reality. Or another example could be Avatar. These are more of the pantheistic kinds of ideas that show up in movies. What about some of the spokespeople? Who's that guy over here? Yoda, remember? Again, what about Yoda? You know, this idea that there was force. There's a good side of the force, but a dark side of the force, right? And so we recognize that we have to overcome some of the illustrations of the force. Deepak Chopra, Shirley MacLaine, the Dalai Lama. Again, these are the pantheistic ideas. So again, what we've looked at are three different worldviews. Now, as we go through the sessions over the next 2 days, we're going to occasionally mention worldview. But can you not see now how important worldviews are? Because what you see, how you perceive the world, is going to make a significant difference in how you come to conclusions about all sorts of topics we're going to address. And more importantly, if you are in an engaged meeting, somebody in terms of evangelism or something like that, you might just kind of say, where are they coming from? And I think the best and wise way to go about that is say, what is kind of behind that question that they're asking? What's behind that particular statement that they made? Because once I understand their worldview, maybe I can begin to ask them some questions, as Steve will do in just a few minutes when we do his presentation, that might get them thinking about whether or not they've adopted a wrong view. And so we really think that this is a good way to equip you to be more effective. Here's some other ways in which we've seen some of these pantheistic ideas, the Da Vinci Code, of course, Harry Potter, the Twilight Saga. I mean, you go through all sorts of examples, and by now I think you're realizing Yes, I've seen some of this on television, I've seen some of this in the movies, I've seen some of this in websites, and if I'm going to be a wise and discerning Christian, I need to begin to think about how I can begin to evaluate those worldviews. But I thought just before we wind down this first session, this one went pretty fast, didn't it? We will then go into some longer sessions. I think you have to recognize that if you really want to understand what's going on, let's go back and look at those two non-Christian worldviews. The naturalistic worldview says that there is no God. Therefore, you need to become your own God to guide you through life. So as a result, we denied the existence of God, so I became God. The pantheistic worldview says there's no transcendent God. God is not external, God is internal, so you're God. If you think about it, pantheism and naturalism are about as far away as you can imagine. Think of a rational scientist who believes in naturalism, and think of maybe a New Age practitioner in the New Age movement. These are about as far apart philosophically as you can imagine. But they come together because both of them ultimately say, you are God. Because in essence, there's really only two different worldviews. The belief that you are God, or the belief that God is God. And so in some respects, even though we started looking at three worldviews, you can see really it comes down to two. Either a belief in God, or a belief that you are God. We wrote a book years ago, which was with Probe Ministries. It had this very difficult title called The Necessity of Ethical Absolutes. It was so hard. But we later retitled it Measuring Morality. But the argument there is, even a person who says, I don't believe in God, they really do. They believe that they are God. Even a person that says, I don't believe the Bible, ultimately there's something they do believe that's as important to them as the Bible. And I think that's one of the things we're going to have to really begin to understand. So as we wind down, let's just mention that if this is something you would like to learn a little bit more about. Of course, I mentioned this book by Jim Sire. There's about 500,000 copies now. I think when that came out, it was 250,000 copies, but almost 500,000 copies. This book published by InterVarsity Press. Still, we think is one of the best books on the subject of worldview. The person that contacted me in Tampa, Florida, was actually taking them through one of the chapters in this book. And that's why they're perhaps tonight actually seeing the same presentation you're seeing. And as a result, that is a very helpful book if you'd like to learn about views. But I also mentioned Summit Ministries. You may be familiar with Summit Ministries. We do a worldview course at our Mind Games camp. We're going to talk more about that as we go through the evening and tomorrow. But they actually have an Understanding the Times curriculum, which is oftentimes used by homeschoolers and Christian schoolers. And then a little bit later, we are going to talk about, which is Periscope, which is something which we hope that you in your church or even in your individual groups might want to use. Steve will talk a little bit more about that. And that one actually is parallel to the two books. And so in just a few minutes after we take a break, when I introduce Steve, I'll talk a little bit about what he's been doing. But these are some resources that we would really want to put in your hands. But if this is helpful to you, if we can, maybe take a break. And I know we've got some things to eat and things to drink. We'll get reset up in just a minute, and we'll bring Steve up here. I'll fully introduce him, and then we'll start talking about this issue of apologetics. And if you're one of those people who says, what is apologetics? Well, you're in for it, because he'll be explaining that to you and help you understand a little bit more how to witness. So let's take a break, and when we come back in just a minute, we'll bring Steve up here. Start talking about this issue of apologetics. Get some snacks.